All right, everyone, we will go ahead and get started for today's webinar. First of all, I appreciate everyone joining today. This is the first of a three-part series around Microsoft Azure Sentinel. My name is Rich Lilly. I am a partner and associate director with Netrix LLC out of Chicago, and I help run our cloud infrastructure and security team. Been working with Sentinel for about a year and a half now, before it was even called Sentinel, and really look forward to talking today about Sentinel and really kind of setting the foundation fundamental items of Sentinel before we get to our other two sessions in the webinar series. This is really meant for anyone that is either a 100 or 0 level, all the way up through someone who may not be aware of even some of the basics. If you're super strong with Sentinel and you've seen kind of the core Microsoft presentations, this may not be for you for today. But even so, you may learn a couple of new things as we go through kind of the core fundamental session. So again, appreciate everyone joining today and look forward to the next hour or so. I will also mention that there is a Q&A section. I will be taking a break here and there to go ahead and check those. So if you do have any questions, I will try to stop about every 15 minutes or so and answer any questions that may come up as well. So one of the things that I think has proliferated over the last, 5+ years here is really the expanded, digital estate. In the past, when we talked about a lot of customer data, our customer data or internal data, et cetera, it was primarily housed around four walls, right? It was easy to consume, easy to really grasp a hold of that content, that data. With where we're at today, though, especially with the times that we're in now with COVID, that real estate isn't just within my four walls anymore, and we need to be able to have a modern platform that can account for that. Gone are the days of our on-premises large SIEM databases, et cetera. This is really where a born on the cloud solution and solutions are starting to thrive, such as Azure Sentinel. Some of the challenges that I hear from many of the different CISOs or security teams that I talk to, these are some of the most common ones. And I'll talk about today when we kind of address Sentinel specifically how that some of these components can be addressed. We're going to start in the right section there, which is the rising infrastructure costs. So as I kind of mentioned, the modern SIEM, the modern environment is primarily cloud native or born in the cloud. So having something that has to consume compute resources, especially for what we're talking about today, storage resources, is just not viable for most organizations anymore. Mostly because with all the immense amount of data that's being brought in, it's extremely difficult to be able to forecast the spend, the cost, the growth, especially as people are covering a lot of the gaps that they've typically had from a SIEM perspective. I think the other challenge is the deployment maintenance. I can talk about many different customers that I've spoken to over the years that they spend more time in just maintaining the solution than they do actually maintaining the events or the incidents that are a result of things that are happening in their environment. The other difficulty is the needle in the haystack syndrome. A lot of organizations I also work with tend to just leverage a SIEM as a checkbox. Fundamentally, it's an audit requirement. So it checks the box for a compliancy, regulatory requirement, customer contracts, et cetera. But the minority really use that data proactively. And we're going to talk about how a lot of that value comes out of tools like Sentinel today. Also, the sophistication of threats. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks alone, we've seen things like Microsoft take down TrickBot. We've seen other emerging web shell exploits that have been more prevalent amongst many others. We need to be able to really take in and correlate multiple different data sets. And that leads on to the next point as well, is that fundamentally when we talk about the power of any SIEM solution, whether it be Sentinel or otherwise, it's really about connecting those data sources and those events and then matching that based on entity types, whether it be a IP address, whether it be a user, whether it be a host. So being able to connect those dots and in a semi-automated fashion or a fashion that's easily repeatable is really critical, especially when I have telemetry coming in from different systems. I may have proof point for email filtering. I may have Okta for an IDP. I may have Office 365. I may have, name your other services of choice. I need to be able to normalize that where possible. If you're looking at the current M365 E5 stack, that makes that process a whole bunch easier, but also recognize and I'm humble that not every customer has that. So being able to connect those variety of data sources is also extremely critical. The other thing that is often overlooked when it comes to SIEM solutions today is also what to do with those events. So a big part of where we're going to go, especially in the next webinar session, is going to be around SOAR, so Security Orchestration Automated Response. So specifically leveraging the data in the events that we're flagging and doing something with them, whether it's an analyst initiated or whether it's an automatically initiated event. This is really critical to optimizing your SecOps process, and reducing the strain on typically your tier 1 and 2 analysts that are just turning and burning alerts and determining if they are actually incidents at that time. The last one is a reality, and I think everyone probably in this session faces it in one way or another today. The security skill market is extremely tight right now. To find good, experienced security professionals, everyone's scooping up the really good ones, right? Microsoft is expanding their global SOC and security offerings. You've got AWS doing the same, GCP, as well as many other tech forms and F500s. So all those really great security people that have the experience are very few and far between. So now what we're having to focus in on is more looking at kind of the build model. So I have a couple of senior folks on staff, but we want to bring in those junior resources that we can really cultivate and make our own. That offers up great new opportunities that have never been had before, but also brings in the potential risk of bringing in someone who's a bit too green. So definitely a fine line to walk, and it's a good balance, and it's a necessary balance to have on any security operations team. So let's talk a bit about kind of the overlay and where Sentinel and things like the SOAR side of Sentinel come into play. The whole goal when we talk about some of those items prior is that, it is about bringing the data together in a cohesive fashion. It is about reducing the time to response, the time to incident close. It is about making the data consumable and easy to use in a core fashion, as well as help drive down the resource consumption that are typically need these high-level resources that can't really materialize good content out of the data that we have access to. And we'll talk about some of these specific points as we move forward here. So first, we'll kind of introduce Azure Sentinel as a whole. I think there's a couple of key points to call out right away. So Sentinel is a SIEM and SOAR platform, so primarily event collecting security events. One of the biggest things that I still combat with a lot of organizations today is many folks that I work with try to leverage a SIEM to just collect anything, right? Kind of like a data lake or a data dump. That's really not, in most cases, what a SIEM should be leveraged for. And it's actually fundamentally very expensive to do so. For anyone that has an EPS-based license today with Splunk or Logarithm or ArcSight, et cetera, that the more logs I ingest, especially the noisy events from, say, the endpoints or my app-specific servers, that costs quite a bit of money. So fundamentally, we want to limit what we're bringing in to just security events. Now, one plug I will make as well, if you do want to get data such as like Network Watcher data or other NetFlow or SFlow or other content that's not 100% directly related to a security event, there are ways to consume that in an Azure Monitor workspace. So just be aware that, while we're talking Sentinel sitting on top of some of these technologies, there are other ways and other places to bring that data in where you don't have to pay that premium for some of the Sentinel ingestion costs. With that, Sentinel is built on Azure, built in the cloud. It is a service that's consumed within Azure, which means it's essentially limitless. For all intents and purposes today, if you're deploying a SIEM on premises still, you have a finite, usually, amount of budget and a finite amount of resources that are allocated for that. Well, as we start to bring in additional applications, we haven't planned for additional logging, we haven't deployed in the past, the whole goal, the whole issue, that we run into is that we didn't plan for that, right? And there's so much more data that now costs more money, and we may need to back that up. We may need to share it across to our DR site, et cetera. That's a very large cost these days. So the goal of having a cloud-based platform is that I can go from A to B and not have to invest any additional infrastructure costs. Yes, there will potentially be Azure costs to go along with that, but I'm not worried about having to plan for that year 3 right up front. I think one of the other big forays into the market that Microsoft made a splash with is being able to bring in a bunch of first-party data for free. This is a really critical one because fundamentally, these workloads cost money. When I talk to a lot of organizations as well today, and I ask, what logs are you pulling in to monitor Office 365? And the answer is either nothing, I'm not sure, or we've got everything. For the first two, what I recommend is that you always, for any Office 365 deployment at a baseline, you always pull in your Office 365 logs, your Azure Activity logs, because there's some really great information in there, as well as Azure Active Directory sign-ins. Those three things are kind of the fundamental core of logging that you need. If you don't have those in your SIEM today and you are on Office 365, you need them. There will obviously be a cost to that. So depending on the size of the organization, if I run 40,000 users, depending on my user base, that could be just for sign-in logs alone, 40 to 180,000 logs every minute. And that adds up, especially when we're talking about EPS-based systems or EPS-based pricing for SIEMs. So the benefit of bringing in O365 data for free, as well as other workloads such as Azure Activity or any of the what used to be called the Microsoft Threat Protection workloads, but now are the M365 Defender stack. So Office ATP and Defender ATP, et cetera. Bringing those in for free in addition to some of those other logs I mentioned is great. And I think the other thing that is extremely important to take away from today is that there are two different types of customers that I work with that consume Sentinel. One customer profile is that they're not happy with their existing SIEM provider of choice today. They really want off of it for whatever reason that may be. It may not be as efficient, may not be cloud friendly, et cetera. In this case, we would typically come in and look for a migration plan to get them over into Sentinel. The other type of customer, which is not talked about enough, in my opinion, but there have been some great blogs from Microsoft on it, is probably our other more common case, which is I have a SIEM solution today, but it doesn't really log or connect to Microsoft stuff well. So my opportunity is to take that data into something like Sentinel and then feed that enriched content down to my traditional SIEM because I'm, maybe a year into my 3-year contract and not really quite ready to make the decision to move everything over right away. This is a really important use case and completely viable. There's some great articles out there. There's actually a tech community article in the Sentinel blog, which I'll showcase in a little bit here, that's specifically how to send enriched events down to Splunk from Sentinel. So there is a coexistence opportunity, even if it is to bring some of those data points and those data connectors in for free. I think the other important part on this slide as well that's maybe not as clear is that I think fundamentally when people think and hear Sentinel, when it was announced at RSA, I still every single day probably get a question from a customer, well, this is just for Microsoft stuff, right? And fundamentally the answer is no, this is not just for Microsoft stuff. Right now, I believe today Microsoft has about 64 different data connectors that are what I would call first-party connectors, meaning they're developed and supported by the Microsoft product group. So these connectors range across, I think, 38 different vendors today, including Microsoft, and are going to be the Cisco's, the Fortinets, the Proofpoints, et cetera. So we're not just limiting scope to Microsoft stuff. So just be aware that there is quite a bit more that I can bring in, and I want to bring in, when possible, as many of those different data points as possible, mostly so that I can really bring those entities together in one place. The more I can correlate, the better I can help proactively protect my users and my environment. The other big piece as well is threat protection with AI. So, everyone's favorite term, AI, ML, et cetera. I will say that Microsoft has in the back end of Sentinel a platform called Fusion. And there's actually just a blog yesterday about some of the improvements and even the bring your own ML models that we can bring to Azure Sentinel as well. So it's not just about looking at static-based analysis. That really only gets us so far. It's about leveraging machine learning and other capabilities within the platform to do some of those predetermined connections between different types of data. This all really aligns back to kind of what you may see with NIST today, kind of protect, detect, respond. From a Sentinel perspective, we're really looking at a collection, and hopefully you're going past just collection into a data lake. The next is detection, the investigation, then response. And Sentinel really looks to cover all 4 of those areas of the compass. Just a quick plug on the Microsoft side. Another conversation I have, almost daily at this point is that, for the last probably 15, 20 years, when you thought the word Microsoft and the word security, you really didn't typically use them in the same sentence. But that's really changed more so when Satya came on board. So every year for at least the last 4 years, I believe now, Microsoft's committed to a minimum $1 billion spend on global cybersecurity. And in fact, in years past, I don't know the numbers for this most recent fiscal. Those numbers have peaked more closer to 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, and I think even closer to 1.8. So again, think of that as a minimum spend. The interesting thing about that number is that number represents, in many cases, more than the top revenues of some of the top security ISVs and providers out there. That's how serious they are about security. And again, proves that they really have come a long way. And again, many of you on the call probably would join me in saying that years ago, I probably wouldn't have used those 2 together, but now it's hard to ignore the investments that Microsoft is making in security and the Defender 365 platform, et cetera. The other is, again, they're growing SOC. So, they started kind of a big effort last year with about 3,500 cybersecurity professionals, and that number is even more now. And I think the other, significant part is the diverse signal. When I think about SIEM providers and threat intelligence providers today, my correlation is only good as where I'm sourcing the data. And in many cases, when we talk about those disparate solutions like Proofpoint and Mimecast and O365 and others, I'm having to stitch together those different fields myself. In Microsoft's case, they do a lot of that for you and feed that into the intelligence security graph in one place. So again, makes that consumable where I would normally have to pull that in from different data sources. We briefly talked about this already, but again, from a scale perspective, there is no infrastructure maintenance from a Sentinel perspective. The only hardware requirement for Sentinel is if I want to collect on-premises data from, say, Syslog. Otherwise, if it's a Windows server, a Linux server, there are agents. Again, if I want to collect firewall data, it's typically going to be egress through Syslog. There's also API support, so if I can programmatically push or pull data from an API perspective, that data can be brought in. But really the only hardware that's needed, if it is needed, is if I'm pulling in things from on-premises. And usually that would sit on a Linux server with Syslog D or rsyslog running and collect the data, which again, if you have a third-party SIEM solution today, or you're even testing with Sentinel, that should be pretty familiar. As I mentioned also, there is auto scale. So again, there's no reason for you have to manage this as an infrastructure service or even as a platform service. From a consumption perspective, as you grow, as your Sentinel instance grows, Microsoft handles all that logic in the back end. So again, truly consuming that as a SaaS service. The other benefit too, pricing model wise, I'm not going to get deep into pricing and licensing today. That's really not why we're here. But there are no infrastructure costs, as I mentioned up front, and also there's no upfront commitment. So you can go out there today, and I believe Microsoft is still offering a 30-day free trial for Azure Sentinel. They've also recently released some promos in the last 60 days as well that if you end up spending over X amount over a 3-month term, they'll actually credit you $25,000. So go, again, recommend checking out the tech community blog, Azure Sentinel blog for that. You may qualify for that. And again, you only pay for what you use. So it's really pay by the drink. And if you've ever consumed an Azure resource, and even for those that haven't on the security specific side, really I pay for what and when I use it. So if I want to retain that data for longer or shorter, there are potentially retention charges or not there. 90-day retention is in box for free. And again, the whole goal is, at least bringing in those free data sets right out of the gate. In many cases, starting with at least Office 365 and some of the M365 Defender workloads. So I talked briefly about integration. Again, one of the things I highlighted earlier was integrating third parties. So, we're not just looking again at that core Microsoft stack, although that is the easiest. When we talk about and when I showcase here and how we plumb that data up in the latter half of the session, A lot of the Microsoft first-party connectors are literally one-click connections with the right permissions. There are, again, about 37 other vendors out there where they have partnered with those vendors to create predefined parsers and logic to be able to connect those data points. Again, you can find quite a few in the catalog out there today. But also, you are not just limited to the 64 or so data connectors that are in scope. If I want to programmatically send any data set from an API et cetera, I can do that as well. And I'll talk about a couple examples of doing that in a custom fashion later in the session. And again, this is a proven log platform. Little bit of a fun fact. I mean, this is based on the platform of Azure Monitor, which used to be Log Analytics and still technically is termed Log Analytics under the core. This platform is what logs from every Xbox instance in the world today. This is what has been done for years under the guise of Azure Log Analytics, as well as a lot of other core Microsoft app platforms as well. But Xbox is definitely one of the most significant. Some really great stories. I think there's actually a great blog out there about that as well. As I talked about earlier, you can also consume Microsoft's native Fusion machine learning engine or bring your own. So if you've got a team that is extremely comfortable on the data science side and you want to build your own machine learning models, great. I also plug the community. There's also some great community-driven and community-built logic out there. And again, there's a pretty great blog, I think, on this just in the last week or so. Okay, so let's kind of take a quick pause here, and we're going to go shift over to some demonstration, kind of just to set the stage from where I covered at least started with the presentation today. So we're going to work through a couple different areas here. So one is I want to kind of talk through and showcase the basics of Sentinel. So this is one of my many instances today, and what you'll see is kind of a landing page for Sentinel. And again, just a very quick breeze through this page. This is telling me my average logs. This is in the last 48 hours, so I may switch that to 24. Here's the average alerts, the incidents as a result of the alerts, the overall incident status, recent incidents, and you can see the incidents over time and potential anomalies. The great thing too is that when you bring in, say, third-party networking gear, in my case, Cisco ASAs, we also can compare the inbound and outbound IP communications with potential C2 or other bad threat intelligence or good threat intelligence. In this case, out of the gate, you consume Microsoft threat intelligence by just being a consumer of Sentinel. But as I'll showcase in just a little bit, you can also supplement that with your own threat intel, whether it be a free provider, a Stix or taxi feed, or a paid provider. So again, not just limited in scope to leveraging Microsoft's. So let's start with connecting up our data, which is really the first major step. I'm not going to go through the tenant creation. That's a little bit too low level for today. But again, just know that when we spin up a Sentinel instance, under the covers, there is also Log Analytics or Azure Monitor Workspace. And again, when you leverage Sentinel, you automatically get 90 days of retention for free. That's up from the standard of 30 days for Azure Log Analytics or Monitor. And again, I'm not going to go through resource group creation, et cetera, kind of the basics. But there are some baseline settings that you'll want to configure. And there's a great best practices document out there on some of those basic items. So where I'm going to focus on first is some of the Microsoft-centric workloads, just because I talked about kind of that easy one-click join process. So if you remember from earlier, I talked about those 3 key logs that really any customer should be importing if they're leveraging Office 365. So we're going to go through those right out of the gate. So the first one is Azure Active Directory logs. This is not a free log ingestion today. So just to be clear on this one, it is a very low consumer from a cost perspective, but it is not free. The average tenancy will consume between $3 and $25 a month on this, just depending on your size and a bunch of other factors. You will see that my data connector is already configured. We've seen data here being piped in over the last week or so. And I'm going to go and open up that connector page, and assuming this wasn't already configured, if I did want to configure this, it is fairly straightforward. This would look something like this. Obviously, this would not be green up here. I would check those boxes, and as long as I am a global admin or security admin in the tenant, that'll automatically set up the log feed from Azure Active Directory to Sentinel. So as I kind of talked about earlier, not quite 1 click, but maybe 3 clicks, checking 2 boxes and hitting OK. And then generally within about 5 to 7 minutes, that log data will start to flow in. This is generally the experience for a majority of the Microsoft-centric data connectors. And let's go through the other two that I talked about. So one of the other ones here is Azure Activity. So Azure Activity also has some key logging metrics for things like conditional access policy changes, or there's some specific O365 functions that are logged to the Azure Activity log. So here would be setting that up, and there's actually, this book takes you to the Azure Activity log egress settings for a specific resource group or for a subscription. And then last but not least here, again, Microsoft centric here, you'll see Office 365 as well. So one big call out here is this will just pull from the management APIs generally for Exchange and SharePoint. Teams was also recently added in public preview, and this essentially has a custom built parser to parse those Teams events out. Do note that if you leverage the management APIs today, this does not pull general all. It also doesn't pull general DLP. So if you want to pull those, there are playbooks either in my GitHub or Microsoft's GitHub to go ahead and pull that data in as well. And I'll showcase an example of that once I get past the initial data connections here. So again, those are just some examples of some first-party ones. Let's talk a bit about some of the third-party ones. So I talked about different scenarios outside of Microsoft. So again, this is a great one of pulling in AWS CloudTrail logs, where you can see some of the basic information about pulling those data points in. And then really the same process is going to go, for other items as well. So again, whether it be Cisco ASA or CyberArk or DNS Windows or even Infoblox DNS. All these have different ways of connecting and plumbing the data in there. So again, if I wanted to, and I want to pick a random one here like Okta, what I can do is I can go over to the open page here and you can see what's required for this to be configured. So in an Okta case, looks like we probably have to set up an API token. We'll go ahead and run the initial configuration leveraging an Azure function, and that's essentially going to feed the data into here moving forward. So again, just allows us to programmatically feed that data in, and that's just essentially an API directly to Sentinel. So again, no intermediate servers or resource required. That would be a little bit different if it was, say, Cisco or one of the on-prem solutions, or Proofpoint Tap, another good example of an API-based one as well. So we've completed step one here, which is really we wanted to get all of our data plumbed up. We want to get that data ingested. So the next part is really talking about what that data looks like in kind of raw form. So if you've ever worked with a third-party SIEM of your choice, you'll note that a majority of them drop things into a variety of tables, and that's really essentially what Sentinel does behind the scenes here as well. If you've ever worked with Azure Log Analytics or Azure Monitor, you'll see the same as well. So when we go look at something like Office Activity, and by the way, you probably saw very quickly there IntelliSense pick up and automatically give me some recommended options there. So the bottom two are functions or parsers I built. In my case, I'm just going to pick Office Activity because I want to query that. If I want to, the most basic form, I can take the most recent 5 events, or take any 5 events and see kind of the context of what's being displayed here. I don't want to scroll all the way across, so if I go look at this, for instance, you'll essentially see the equivalent, what is filtered as a SharePoint event from the general all log specifically. So you can see some different actions taken by Mike here. This is probably the most important part of Sentinel that you can walk away with today. Having a core understanding of Kusto, which is the querying language, is absolutely critical to being successful with Sentinel. I will say that Microsoft has great documentation if you are a Splunk admin today, if you know SQL language pretty well. There's some good references to how do you translate operators and functions from what you know today in those systems to Kusto. I also plug Pluralsight has, I believe, still a free 8-hour Kusto course, which anyone can go out there and register for and take. You don't have to have a paid subscription. And that will help you kind of understand even the basics of Kusto. And I recommend this because when we start getting into the next items like analytics, which are really essentially alerts, or we get into the workbooks, which are more views or dashboards, those are all 100% based on Kusto. So having a good understanding of Kusto and how to work with it in the most kind of basic form is something that every admin should know. Again, no different if you're adminning Splunk or working with SQL queries in the back end. So I'm going to build something build something on the fly here. I'm going to do it pretty quickly. And we're going to just talk through how I'm building this live. So one of the things I want to do is I essentially want to look at, if we look at some of the properties of this, I want to go ahead and look at all the Office activity, and I want to look at it based on this field right here, which is operation. So what I want to do is I want to do a summarize count. So that's going to get me a unique count by operation. And that's just going to end up giving me totals of in the last 24 hours for all Office activity. So here we go. There's every operation. I can do the total count. Now I can manually sort that. I can also go down here and do sort by count descending. Voila, now it just did the sorting for me. So as I would expect, mailbox items access is one of the top. So now I've got that. So let's kind of work with this data a little bit more. I'm not just done with this data. I can make this a dashboard. I can make this a view. I can even just make it a static page that gives me the totals and refreshes automatically. That doesn't do much for me though. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and render this as a pie chart. So we can actually do native visualizations within the platform here. And we'll see if I just do a quick render pie chart. Voila, we can see, there we go, the different events, counts, sort from top down, etc. So again, it gives me a really good layout of that. So I can also do some of that basic visualization. Let's go back up though, and I want to do something a little bit more specific. So let's actually up this to the last 7 days. And what I want to do is I want to bin this or group it essentially over the course of some time. So I essentially want to distribute this based on the amount of time over the course of binning by 1 day. And in this case, I want to go ahead and render this as a time chart. So what this is going to do, it's going to give me the summary of for each operation by day, and then it's going to go ahead and render that as a time chart. So now you can actually see the trends of these specific events over the course of time. And again, as you would expect, the mailbox items accessed here are pretty are mostly the highest. There's actually a couple higher here on file sync uploads and file access. But the whole point here is that I can consume and really manipulate and work with this data. I can also union this data with other things. So if I wanted to, I could write a query to look at Office activity and then pull the IP address or the MFA claim that was passed during that from the sign-in logs. And again, that's really where a lot of the power of any SIEM is the correlation of some of those different events. All right, so I think that's enough on just the core logging side here. Excuse me. Again, hopefully you get the concept. This is really just barely scratching the surface. So let's kind of talk next about the rule sets and specifically what are termed analytics. So Microsoft has approximately 100 and I think 110 or so inbox alerts or rules today, meaning pre-built logic that I don't have to go out and consume or build myself. With every customer that we work with, we always recommend going through this and determining the relevancy in your environment. And that's pretty easy to do. So we just scroll down here and I want to look at this Office policy tampering. So I may not know what this is right out of the gate, but I can tell you that this identifies if any tampering is done to auditing, ATP safe linker attachments, anti-phish, or DLP. Perfect. That sounds like something I would want in the case there was a breached account and someone got in and changed a policy. So one of the things I see immediately I see 3 green marks here next to the type of logs that I need to be able to run this query. And fortunately, all 3 of those are connected with pretty recent data pulls. We can also see the MITRE ATT&CK tactic alignment, so it's persistence and defense evasion. And Microsoft has gone ahead and pre-built the query for me. If we actually just browse this really quickly, what's interesting is they're essentially looking back for the last day. They're looking for the record type of Exchange admin, and the user type in the raw logs is called admin or DC admin. They're looking for any operation that is starts with a remove or a disable, and then any one of those policies I talked about. And then essentially there's some data cleanup and things that make it look a bit prettier here, and ultimately displays this out to me as a consumer. So in this case, this rule runs once a day and it looks for content from the last day. And we're looking for a result greater than 0, any change, right? Any change to one of those policies. And we want to group all similar events into a single alert. So that's kind of the context very quickly here. And I've determined that to be valid. So I would go over here and hit create rule. And I would go ahead and validate what's in the baseline logic today. We can see here that some of the core fields are what I want. If I want to, maybe I want to decrease that and run that every hour. Maybe I don't care if it's 0. I want to know if it's greater than 1. And again, I can choose on the grouping and suppression, etc. I can also manage some of the incident settings here, and I can also even trigger an automated response. So maybe that automated response is to connect to O365 via PowerShell and set the inverse setting and re-enable it. Or maybe as a result of this action, I need to, in a different scenario, block a user from sign-in. This is really where you start to kind of combine the SOAR with the detection side. You can see here that I've got a variety of playbooks in my environment that do different things. Some are sourced from Microsoft, some are ones that we've sourced ourselves or built ourselves. And this is really the power when we start to get into what an analyst would typically do as a result of a very specific event. But if that happens multiple times and I have the same type of reaction, why not automate it? That's really the goal of kind of removing the work that may have to go into your tier 1 or even 3 workers. So in addition to the Microsoft templates, you can also bring your own as well. So you can see some different ones here that I've created around data loss prevention, reset of the KRB TGT password, logins from different countries, use of a break glass account, etc. And all this, again, is 100% based on Kusto querying language. So this is one that is not built in, but it is very valuable, is that when we don't get logs from one of our on-premises data sources in 5 minutes, we flag an event saying that we're not receiving any logs. And I know this because, in our case, our Cisco ASAs or mostly any edge firewall device is extremely chatty. So that may indicate an issue, not necessarily an intruder, but it just may indicate that something's failed, whether it be the logs are full on the collector, whether it be an issue with the sending systems, etc. We don't want to have a gap in coverage. And again, you'll see different ones in here that, again, we built or brought to the table. I will also mention for anything on any of these, there's a great GitHub repo as well that I'll plug towards the end of the deck before I take Q&A that are also have some great examples that aren't directly in the portal here right out of the gate. All right, so let's pivot over to incidents, and what does it look like as an event is generated from one of those rules or analytics. So this is a current queue of events in one of my tenants. So again, we can see some of the different event types here. So we can see some failed basic auth attempts. We can see some defender flags. We can see events being coming in from cloud app security or even phishing URLs. So I'm just going to take this event and talk through what an analyst workflow would look like in this. You do not have to work your incidents in Sentinel. Many of my customers will take this into their Sentinel instance, and then they may egress that to an ITSM tool. In most cases, though, you don't want to open an incident for every alert. That tends to be fairly tedious and gets very noisy. So let's just assume that I'm working that in here. So as an analyst, I'm going to go ahead and assign that to myself. We'll go ahead and mark this active. And I'm going to take some of my first steps. So one of the things I can do right here is I can go to investigate here and see some of the basic details. Now, it's already done some automated entity mapping here. So we already know that these two properties are in this event, which is an IP for unfamiliar sign-ins and the user account. So what's nice is with some of the new entity-based views here as well, I also have the ability of seeing additional details on those. I can look at the specific event types. I can look at where those landed on a timeline. But more importantly, I can also quickly run different queries directly on one of the objects. So for instance, if I wanted to, I could hover over this IP address, and it's going to quickly, with the 3 dots moving there, run through different examples of queries that may find other related users that have come in from this IP address, or other related activity from Azure Active Directory, etc. So the whole goal here is that I can quickly see and pivot over to some of these other pieces. So if I wanted to, I could say the most active accounts from this IP address and expand, and then it would take me over to the raw data or visualize that. It's taking a second here, not quite sure why. But again, I can pivot then over to other users that have come in from an IP address. So maybe that account has an issue on it, or maybe that IP is something that's coming in from a threatened location. We'll try this again only because it's my the demo gods may or may not be with me today. And you'll see these highlight or non-highlight, again, based on the return results. So if this returns 0, then that means no other accounts have been accessing our tenant from the service. If it returns a value, then I could click the button and expand that out and show the other user object. So I can really pivot around the data. Outside the visualization, I can also go over into the full incident details. Now I've already gone ahead and assigned the incident. I've already created some basic details. I can create my tag. I can say, you know, looking into this. And now that's tagged on the actual incident itself. And a couple other things I can do from here. So one is you can see the raw data set, which is in this case coming in from Azure AD Identity Protection. If I wanted to, I could go click this button as an analyst and automatically click off and manually click off a playbook, excuse me. So a good example of that, for instance, is I may choose to go get some geographical information from one of the Microsoft provided playbooks, or again, there's some other great ones out there, like Rod Trent did a really great IP geotagging playbook as well. And what this is going to do, it's going to take those entities like the IP and the incident. And in my case, I'm taking that directly out to an open API and then returning the results and tagging that in the incident. So now if we actually go back and refresh the page for that incident, we should see that it's automatically tagged those IP addresses as a Microsoft Corp ASN, and it was from Des Moines, Iowa in the US. So that would, again, prevent me from having to open up, you know, a search browser, go find that somewhere else, et cetera. And you can also do this with any programmatic interface. So there's sample solutions for like URL House. There's different solutions for different threat intelligence providers. The goal is that I don't need to pivot into a new browser tab or another platform or somewhere else to do these things, but instead I can execute these directly from the UI. And again, that's going to apply in an analyst-initiated model or also in an automated function. And we're going to get a lot deeper into automation in our next webinar series as well, our session 2. So I'm going to really glaze over some of the stuff with a bigger focus in our follow-up one. At a high level, just to kind of really quickly show what that looks like, though. So if we go ahead and just take our playbook that I ran there. This is all built on top of logic applications. Again, we'll get more into this. If you've worked with Power Automate or Flow in the past, this should look and feel familiar. And all this is really doing is it's getting the IP entity from the incident. It's going against the IP-API, open API endpoint, and then it's returning the results, or parsing the JSON, returning the results, and tagging the incident. So fundamentally, when I look at that in their actual runtime, we can actually see that process happening. So here was the HTTP call out to IP-API. This was parsing the return fields here. And then this was tagging those into the incident. Again, we'll get much deeper in this in the next webinar series. But again, these playbooks are extremely powerful from a SOAR perspective. I think the last item or two I'll cover before I just open it up for Q&A. And feel free again to drop your questions in the Q&A. I will get to them right after this and get through as many as I can in about the last 10 minutes of today's session. The last major item I think I want to cover, or maybe the two here, are around workbooks. So workbooks are essentially equivalent of dynamic dashboards. Again, Microsoft provides about 73 different templates today. Ones that they've already built the context and logic for, so I don't have to go out and build anything from scratch. So as a very quick, for instance, if we go over here to Exchange Online, you'll go ahead and see I can view save workbook, and I haven't had to go out and build or you know, think about what I want to see. Microsoft gives me kind of a good foundation on what those items are. So right out of the gate, it's automatically refreshing. So again, I can change this query to say 7 days, and then it'll dynamically adjust everything on the page per whatever my requirements are, or I can filter that down into specific event types. You can really, and you can customize Microsoft's provided ones as well. So if I wanted to add a dropdown for user in here, I could have a dropdown for user based on UPN, and then I can get all this on a per user basis. So here you can see in just the out-of-the-box Exchange Online dashboard, we get user type activities, admin activities, potentially suspicious activities, hard deletes, mailbox logins, new mailbox created, etc. And again, as far as editing or changing these, extremely easy. I can go to edit, I can clone a view, I can change the query and display that how I want. Again, all backed by Kusto. So we go look at this one, for instance, it's all backed by a Kusto query looking for Exchange Office workload and Office activity, and then just doing some filtering based on those drop-down properties I have above. But again, fairly straightforward to start to consume. In addition to Microsoft provided templates, you can also build your own. So for instance, I have built a handful of my own here, and I'll pull up one for Office Advanced Threat Protection. This is out of my GitHub repository that I'll plug towards the end here as well. So this is one that'll source all the events from the management API and then visualize the verdict and detection methods and the data that you typically see in the Microsoft Protection Portal. So top senders by IP, by user. I can even then search by the recipients here and see exactly, I'm not in any of these logs, so I won't. Looks like I'm not returning any results there. But these are 100% customizable, and you can also pin these views as well. So if I want to, I can pin these on my Azure Sentinel dashboard for the things that I personally care about. Not the entire view, but I care about just, green, yellow, red when I come in the morning. I want to see things about DNS, legacy authentications, Intune commands that have run, detection methods, and OATP. So this is kind of my priority that I want to see first thing in the morning. And you can obviously build your own curated views around that. I think the last topic I'll cover for today, it technically is in preview, but the function of ingesting threat intelligence is not. So one of the things is always about what other additional threat intelligence can I build, especially for customers that have QRadar, Splunk, LogRhythm, et cetera. They typically have normalized threat intelligence areas as a Sentinel. So Sentinel has an open API that just requires one permission to be able to write new threat intelligence. So if I were to just query my table of threat intelligence, which is essentially normalized data, you'll see a bunch of different events have been pulled in the last 24 hours. And again, by proxy, you consume Microsoft's threat intelligence by being a Sentinel customer, but also you can feed in your own. So a couple different examples here of what we feed in is if we actually go back to data connectors down here and go to threat intelligence platforms, you'll see here that this is just an open API that I can write to. In my case, I have a script. I have a logic app that I have or a playbook that I have within my GitHub repo that'll query Alien Vault OTX and then pull those indicators down on a regular basis, usually a nightly load. Also added in preview fairly recently was taxi, Stixer taxi integration. So in this case, I can also pull any Stix feeds, taxi feeds that I want to. So in my case, I'm pulling some of the other free open ones, such as Anomaly Limo or IBM Threat Exchange. So what this now means is I have curated threat intelligence from my trusted sources, or you can bring your own from other sources as well. If you're in FinServ, there's a lot of FinServ ones out there, healthcare, et cetera. And what that also means is that from an analytic perspective, I've already got pre-built rules around threat intelligence detections, and Microsoft's done the legwork to normalize the data. So for instance, one of the last things I'll show here before I take questions is this, we'll take this, I'm trying to find a good one here. We'll do this IP map to Office activity. So what this is essentially doing is for every unique IP in the Office activity log, so any action taken by any user, is compared against the entire threat intelligence database that we have based on the term we have. So, 24 hours or whatever the data we're pulling in it is for. And then if that IP matches a known piece of threat intelligence, we're going to flag an event called TI map IP entity to Office activity. Sorry, I can't say that quickly. So now we are automatically correlating our sign-in logs or our Office activity against our trusted TI providers. Again, something you don't just get right out of the gate with, say, Office 365, but really the power of where something like Sentinel can provide value. All right, so I did want to keep the last 10 minutes or so for question and answer. So if you just bear with me 1 second here, I'm going to pivot over. Actually, while I do that, I am going to pull up two quick things here. Actually, a few quick things. Just because I talked about them. So a couple of quick things I didn't get to talk about today that we will get to in a follow-up session are how to visualize some of the data out of Sentinel with Power BI. So this is an example of a Power BI dashboard of something that I showed earlier. I also massively plug two things. One is I'm not selfish, so I'll plug the Microsoft Azure Sentinel GitHub repository. There's absolutely an immense amount of changes going into here every single day. And I did mention some of the key areas, such as some of the different queries and data connectors. You'll always find a whole bunch of different valuable items in here. And then also, I have published a lot of pieces on my own GitHub repository about some of the things we talked about today. So for things like Power BI dashboards or parsers, et cetera. And then the other thing I talked about as well was the Azure Sentinel Tech Community blog. So these, again, three really key links to take away from today. you can go out and Bing them, fairly easy to find. If not, you can always ping me or the marketing team. We'll get those out to you as well. All right, so now I promise, I think that's the last of that screen share. So let me go ahead and check for any questions or answers really quickly here. So we did have a question specifically around how to handle alert egress, which is a great one I didn't really dig into deeply. So from an alert egress perspective, so when I say egress, I mean, how do I take an event from just outside of the portal, right? My analysts aren't going to be and don't want to be in that portal every single minute of every single day. Microsoft has some predefined playbooks to do things like send an email or to post to Teams or post to Slack or name one of your many options of choice. We'll get into this a little bit more in the next session, but what's critical is that these logic apps have about 400, as of last week, about 400 different unique data connectors, or I can connect to any RESTful endpoint. So however I want to take those events out in whatever form, I can do that. And there's actually also a great one that just got published yesterday for identity, or an identity related playbook. They actually published an adaptive card to a Teams channel. It has a really, really great experience. So again, definitely something I'll talk a little bit more about in the next section. One of the other questions I got was around watch lists. So watch list was introduced in preview a couple of weeks ago. I'll actually plug Rod Trent's blog. I think he's one of the few folks that have actually talked about what a watch list is and how to use it. So prior to watch lists, I'll kind of lay out a scenario. So I want to potentially correlate a set of data points. So maybe a set of trusted IPs for my data centers, maybe a specific set of admin user accounts, any type of quantifiable list, whether it's a static list or a dynamic list. And I want to be able to use that in my query. In the past, I could have done that a couple of different ways. I could have just wrote a query that was where X in, and then list out my items, item 1, item 2, item 3. The other options, I could also use an external data operator. So I could, go ahead and look that up against, say, a CSV file that's on Azure Blob Storage, and I could just maintain that Blob Storage file. With watch lists, I can actually do this all in the UI and create my own lists. You cannot dynamically do them today that I've seen via API, but I haven't looked completely yet at that. But I can do things like import lists from anything. Like I can import a static list from a TI provider. I can import it from anything I have that's that can be in a normalized field to do that. And really cool function that, in my mind, I've always been comfortable doing the other ways, but this does make it more consumable for different users. We also had another question on data retention. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but data retention for Azure Sentinel is automatically free for 90 days. I will make an important call out that Sentinel, when you onboard a new Sentinel workspace, it does get set as the default of 30 days. So at any time, you can go over into the settings in the workspaces view and increase that to 90 days. And there will be no additional retention charges based on setting that. Feel free to toss any other questions in the chat window. I'm just looking for any others that I haven't covered here. I think that's about all we have. So one last thing before we wrap here, I'm going to go ahead and plug our next section. So let me just reshare my PowerPoint here. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part 1 of a 3-part series. It was really meant, again, at the fundamentals or foundational items around Azure Sentinel. Our next session coming up, if you haven't registered for that, please do. It's probably one of my favorite sessions, which is really focused in on SOAR. So we're going to spend a much deeper hour on just playbook creation, automation, when and how to use it, and a whole bunch of different great scenarios, and even some automated tools we built to help bring this to the masses in the last couple of weeks. So definitely appreciate everyone joining today. Again, this has been a great session for me, some great questions, and I do appreciate everyone taking the time. So look forward to having you again in one of our follow-up sessions. If you have any questions, feel free to ping myself or our marketing team. Everyone have a great afternoon.